Okay, thank you everybody for being with us in this new live webinar series. We're very glad and very excited about this new collaboration with Hendrix Genetics. And we are presenting today Estella Leentfaar, that she has been with us in a previous webinar. So as always, this webinar is going to be recorded and then it's going to be accessible in our YouTube and our platforms. So today, Estelle is going to be talking about unlocking egg production potential, the latest nutrition guides. These guides are very helpful, and she will be explaining how to navigate. And Estella, thank you very much for being with us. And after her presentation, we'll have a couple 10-15 minutes if there is any other questions. So, Estella, thank you, and the time is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Indeed, I will tell you something more about the production potentials and how to achieve this, and also in combination with the latest nutrition guide, which has just been launched a few months ago. So first of all, if we check the white egg layers and we compare 1980 compared to 2024, we clearly see a difference in terms of the egg weight development, where before the egg weight keeps on rising, we really now try to flatten them off. Why? Because then we can use the birds much longer, and you will see a much more stable production graph, production performance. Obviously, this bird requires different nutrients, different changes compared to the birds years ago. Similar is for the brown egg layers. There we do see clearly similar trends, although they will decline a little bit more when they're getting older compared to the whites. But also the browns, they really need to adjust their nutrition time by time to have the same production performance and to achieve this. If we also check, for example, egg weights, I mentioned we are trying also with genetics, we really try to flatten this off because we do see positive effects on livability and on production persistency. And this is also clearly what you see year after year. Here you do see from one country with one genetics, the combination of 2024 in yellow and 2025 in green. And you clearly see early egg weight is increasing. So you have directly the saleable eggs, and late egg weight is decreasing. Before, we were also with nutrition trying to reduce late egg weight to prevent this push at the end of the cycle. But nowadays, we actually do see already with genetics, we do have this change. So it's not per se necessary anymore to make those big jumps when the birds are getting older, but I will explain you later on. Also, I mentioned the production persistency is improving, and this is an example of our pure line bird where we collect individual data, and there we clearly saw that as soon as the bird starts producing an egg, it almost produces one egg a day. She just missed one egg in the late laying period, which also obviously means that she needs to have all those nutrients the total production cycle long. Only when they start decreasing, the requirements are changing. So individually, you might have also birds within your flock which are very high productive, and that's good to keep in mind, which I also will explain. First, going one step back more towards the basic, we always start with a good quality pullet. If you don't have a good quality pullet, you will not reach the production potentials. And what do we mean with a good quality pullet? It's the body weight profile during rearing, and then mainly the 5 weeks of age body weight and uniformity at transfer. It is a proper feed intake capacity, because the more the birds are used to eat, the smoother the transition will be towards the layer phase, where they suddenly need to increase the feed intake quite rapidly because of the extra need by egg production. Flock uniformity at transfer, as mentioned. If applicable, also the quality of beak trimming, so the age and the type of method which is being used is very important. The age at sexual maturity, because this will also determine what is the egg weight that you will get. And of course, the health status, which includes a healthy pullet, but also a fully vaccinated pullet. Why? Because if we look to the influence of the different parameters on performance, then we do see at 5 weeks of age, there is a very high correlation, which means the higher body weight we see at 5 weeks of age, the more eggs per hen housed we receive in the production period, the better liveability and the higher production persistency. When the bird is getting older, we do see that this correlation is going down, which basically means that the actual body weight does not really have a direct positive effect anymore on later life performance. For uniformity, it's different. For uniformity at transfer, we clearly see a high correlation again with later life performance, which basically means the more uniform your flock, the higher production results you will get. And this also makes sense. Why? The more uniform your flock, the more easy it will be to manage. They need to have the light stimulation and the feed changes all at the same time. So this really works. If we talk about uniformity, we count uniformity as the average plus and minus 10%. And for white birds, we achieve a uniformity of 90% or higher. The higher, the better. And for brown birds, the target goal should be 85% or higher as well. But to come back on the 5 weeks, why this is so important, if we start looking back towards the different development status of the bird, then we clearly see organ development is taking place for the first 5 to 6 weeks. And organ development at the end is converting all your nutrients into egg mass, into growth, and so on. So organ development is very, very key for later life egg production and also for reaching your potential. So this 5 weeks of age organ weight is very, very important, and that should be your major goal. You can never have them overweighted for the first 5 weeks. Afterwards, we see skeleton and muscle development, both of them, which basically means already quite early in rearing, you frame the bird. You define the size and the robustness of your bird quite early, and afterwards, it's more about maturation. The reproduction tract development and the medullary bone development is very clearly linked with the sexual maturity. So this starts just a few weeks before real egg production, which means if you delay your bird coming into production, this will slightly be later compared to what is presented over here. Just some updates about, so that's just a heads up about reaching the right pullet quality to achieve full potential. And now I would like to continue with some changes in the management guides. So what are the major differences in the nutrition guides? We updated some amino acid profiles. We added SID, digestibility matrix, and we updated the mineral strategy. I will explain you more one by one now. So within the rearing part, we updated the calcium and phosphorus ratios. Why? Recent research really shows that the ratio between calcium and phosphorus is very crucial for having the right bone growth and bone formation. And actually during the starter, grower, and developer, bone formation is the key goal for the minerals. Obviously, a starter phase is slightly higher in calcium. And when a bird is getting older, in general, we are slightly reducing the amount of calcium, which also means if you would like to maintain the right ratio, that you also will reduce your phosphorus. There's a lot of deviation in calcium sources being used, calcium levels being used, but you can see obviously with the minimum and maximum, this allowance is being there. Sometimes we tend to see that people start with lower calcium levels at starter phase and increasing when the bird is getting older. Obviously, we increase from a developer towards a prelay, but between the starter and the developer, it's not common to increase calcium, and it's not helping the bone formation as well. Why? A bird in a developer phase will have a higher feed intake anyway, so is consuming more calcium and phosphorus on a daily basis anyway. From the prelay onwards, you don't see a ratio being mentioned anymore. Why? In the prelay diet, we focus a lot on medullary bone development, but we also focus on having some calcium available for those first eggs, which might be produced. And egg shell formation only requires calcium carbonate, while bone formation, which includes the medullary bone, as well as the structural bones, that requires really this calcium phosphorus combination. So from the prelay onwards, you will see a higher calcium requirement compared to phosphorus, and then this ratio doesn't make sense anymore. So this is being updated in the rearing mineral levels. Then some amino acid levels. We also updated the amino acid levels. and also the amino acid ratios between them. Why we did see that, for example, methionine was a little bit lacking in the starter phase, and that might limit growth, while I just explained that growth in the starter phase is very, very crucial. Some people say this makes the starter feed perhaps more expensive, but also please take into account the feed intake is very, very limited compared to the overall feed intake of your bird. And this really pays off if you have this extra body weight gain at the starter phase. Well, in some other amino acids were a little bit too high. So in general, we revised all the amino acid profiles in rearing and we updated them to those levels. Here, by the way, you see the total level of available apparent fecal digestible lysine, and here you do see the different ratios. The nutrient flow of a laying hen, I always say comparing energy is a very, very difficult one because we have different energy systems. We have the CVB, NRC, INRA, and so on. But also some people take into account an uplift of energy by enzymes. Some people don't take this into account. So energy is very difficult to compare between you and your neighbor or between feed mill A and feed mill B. What is more important is to follow on the flow of energy. What we basically would like to see is a very high starter diet, a very concentrated starter diet, because those birds have a limited feed intake but maximum growth. So we should support them at maximum. That's happening in the starter phase. And then when the birds are getting older, energy level is decreasing to stimulate feed intake. The prelay can have a similar or slightly higher energy value compared to a developer phase, but the start really needs to be higher compared to a developer phase. In countries where oil is lacking and fibers are lacking, this is very, very difficult to achieve. That's also something we do know, because in the layer phase, you start adding a lot of calcium, and calcium has no protein and no energy value. But most important, between the developer and the layer phase, you would like to increase energy. And then depending on the body weight of the bird, you might consider reducing energy values over time during the layer phase. That's also presented in our recommendations. For protein, it's more or less similar. So concentrated at the start, slightly going down because feed intake is going up. So then protein can go down as well. The protein level in the layer phase should be higher than the protein level in your developer phase, because also the bird is requiring to start egg production, and egg production also requires quite some protein. And depending on how persistent your laying cycle is, you can reduce protein levels if you like. What's most important during the rearing phases, in the rearing diet, we only switch based on body weight, which means if you have normally a switch at 4 weeks of age, but something happens, perhaps a disease outbreak, and therefore growth is a little bit suboptimum, it is better to extend your starter diet to 5 weeks. So really, really measure your body weights and focus on steering on those. It's better to delay the switch with 1 week than having a lower body weight. In the layer phase, we really, really focus on egg mass production. Why? If you see that you're in the top performing birds and the egg mass production is very, very high, the bird also requires the same amount of nutrients, so amino acids basically, to continue doing so. The only big change that you will have then is in calcium supply. I will come back on calcium later. What is the total egg mass? The egg mass is basically the egg weight times the laying persistency. So your egg mass will always be slightly lower than your egg weight itself, but this can help you to indicate how much protein should I have in my diet. Why? Because there is a very, very clear link between the parent fecal digestibility, digestible lysine, and between egg mass. So here you see the daily egg mass, which is presented, and the lysine requirement. When the bird is getting older, it starts deviating a bit more, but this is very crucial to understand, and also therefore to know if your bird is performing above standard, you will need to delay the changes to a layer 3 or layer 4 diet, just to make sure that your bird has enough nutrients. Perhaps you still remember my second slide not second, but somewhere in the beginning, the slide where I showed this one bird producing almost 100% all the time. That's also the effect of uniformity. Uniformity is very, very crucial. Why? We tend to see that if your uniformity in your flock is lower and your daily egg mass starts declining, it means that you have some of the birds producing still every day one egg, and you have some birds which are not so much producing anymore. If you then start changing on a very early level, those top producing birds cannot keep up anymore because they will have a shortage of nutrients. So when your uniformity is lower, we tend to advise not to change too quickly either. If you're indicating this 85% in browns or 90% in whites, you can switch. But otherwise, please be a bit more careful with this. This will be a little bit more difficult. For some, you can just forget it. But for the nutritionist, we have apparent fecal digestibility and we have standard ileal digestibility. And the difference is mainly the location of measurement. So one is measured with the fecal content and one is measured at the ileum. What are the differences if we look to them? Well, the standard ileal digestibility is more recent research. It's more for the later years instead of the last decades. There is no significant absorption of amino acids after the ileum. So when you start measuring at the ileum, in the next slide, I will show you a picture. You will see that this part has not really an influence on the bird requirements of amino acids. The standard ileal digestibility corrects also for the endogenous losses. And if we look to the values in general, then the standard ileal digestibility in general has higher values compared to the apparent fecal digestibility. Well, in the past, we were using the totals, but once you start using also other raw materials, it's better to focus on digestible amino acids instead of the totals. And now we also have 2 digestible amino acids to make life more complex. In general, you can use both of them. That's no problem at all, but it's very important to use the corresponding nutritional table. So if all your raw materials in your formulation program are based on apparent fecal digestibility, you should use also the requirements of apparent fecal digestibility. If all your values in the raw material matrix are used on standard ileal digestibility, you should also use the standard ileal digestibility recommendations. So that's most important. I always like explaining in pictures because it's a bit more easy. So here we see a lot of amino acid absorption. Amino acid absorption is going down when we are coming further inside the intestinal tract. And actually after the ileum, there's hardly amino acid absorption. There is a lot of protein synthesis by the bacteria between the ileum and the fecal content. And some protein degradation as well. This is not taken into account in the SID, where we really focus on what does the animal need, but this is included in the AFD, where we focus on the total. And that's the reason that SID tends to be a little bit more accurate compared to the AFD. The mineral strategy. So in total, it takes around 24 hours to produce 1 egg. Otherwise, we cannot have birds producing 1 egg every day. Calcification takes around 21 hours. So calcification is really the major part of total egg production, 20 to 21 hours. This also takes place mainly during the dark period. So from those 20 to 21 hours, it's not a straight line in calcium deposition. No, it starts slow, then we have a peak in calcium deposition, and then it reduces again. And it mainly takes place in the dark period. What's always the negative side of a dark period? When there's no light, there's no feed intake. So it also means there is no access to new calcium sources. Therefore, we really focus a lot on increasing the amount of calcium which is available during the night, because this will improve your egg shell quality, both on short term as well as on long term as well. You can work for this with the feeding times. So you can work a bit with making sure you have more calcium in the late afternoon. We can work with the calcium particle sizes, because we tend to see that coarser calcium sizes have a lower solubility. This is not a one-to-one relation. So in some countries, we have an exception, but in general, coarser particles have a lower solubility. And what does a lower solubility mean? It means that within a certain time slot, there is less of your calcium being dissolved. When there's less dissolved, there's less available for your laying hen. So it just takes much longer before this calcium source is being depleted, is being totally dissolved. And when it takes longer, it also means that we have a longer availability of calcium within the animal. So if we look to calcium metabolism in general, we can summarize it as being quite complex. That's the negative side. The positive thing is we can also activate it. We can train it. Why? It's an active system. It's an active absorption. So we can help the bird and help the bird to utilize it. First of all, vitamin D is involved. So vitamin D is converted in the liver or hydrolyzed in the liver towards hydroxy D3. This is hydrolyzed in the kidneys towards the 125 hydroxy D3, which is at the end the hormonal form, which is influencing or which is helping the calcium and phosphorus absorption. So you need to have this form, which means that if either the liver or kidneys are being damaged, this conversion is going down in efficiency, and also calcium and phosphorus absorption is going down. When calcium and phosphorus are being absorbed via the digestive tract, then during the morning mainly, it goes towards the medullary bone, because this is functioning as a calcium reservoir. I will show you soon. And during the night, calcium is going directly towards the shell glands. So it either goes via the bloodstream towards the shell glands or via the bloodstream towards the medullary bone. The good thing of this medullary bone is during the night, it can open up the calcium and make the calcium available for eggshell formation, and phosphorus will be excreted via the kidneys. And the next morning, this can be rebuilt again. In general, as I mentioned, so this is an active process, which means if we feed the bird more towards the needs of the bird, we can help the system to maintain more efficiently. And we can teach the bird to utilize the calcium supply more efficiently as well. And especially when a bird is getting older, we do know calcium utilization is going down. So via making sure in the beginning that they can utilize it more efficiently, you will see the benefits on later life. But I will explain you. First, to come back on the types of bones. In general, humans have two types of bones, and mainly the structural ones, so the cortical and the cancellous bone. But in all egg-laying birds, so not only our laying hens, but all birds who are producing an egg, we do see a medullary bone. A medullary bone is basically inside the cortical and cancellous bone, and it functions as a calcium reservoir. This is something which develops around sexual maturity. That was the reason why we start increasing calcium levels. And it really functions as this main storage. So where a structural bone can also provide calcium towards the bird, but cannot renew it so easily the next morning, and at a certain moment you get bone health issues, is that medullary bone does have this capacity to be used during the night and being rebuilt in the next morning, as you can do this over and over again. The majority of the medullary bone is being stored in the upper legs of the bird, and that's where the majority of the calcium is coming from. Roughly 70% of the calcium supply is coming from your diet, and 30% is coming from the medullary bone directly. Then always just a question on how much calcium is actually required for eggshell formation, because most people know more or less what to put in the diet, and then you know the feed intake, so you can calculate how much calcium is available for your laying hen. But if we start calculating what is actually required for just producing one egg, then we are much lower than we are feeding in practice, which also makes sense. But the calcium requirement for one eggshell formation is between 2.3 and 2.5 grams per hen per day. When the egg is getting a little bit older, and when she's getting a bit older, we see more calcium deposition, so also more calcium required. You might think this is very low, but also take into account calcium utilization rates I mentioned. So for protein, we're looking to very high utilization rates. So a lot of the protein we are providing is being really used by the animal. For calcium, this is much lower because it's not so efficient process. So in calcium utilization, at the start of lay, it's somewhere around 70%. And when the bird is getting older, it is only going down. It's the same for humans. That's the reason why we see more bone health issues with elderly people, for example. Also, calcium utilization is going down. So if we start correcting the calcium requirement for the utilization rate that the bird can have, then we are somewhere between 3.3 grams per hen per day in the beginning and around 4 grams per hen per day when she's getting older. We tend to be on the safe side, so we are slightly higher in our recommendations, especially when your birds are in cages. Why? When you're on cage housing, you have less bone metabolism already, and there's less movement possibility, so that will affect your bone health. And in cages, they don't have the possibility to select calcium when necessary, somewhere from the feeder chain or perhaps from the litter. So it's a bit safer to go down on alternative systems compared to going down so much on cage housing. But still in cage housing, we can go down a bit. You might wonder, why would you like to decrease calcium levels? Because it's a cheap ingredient anyway. But actually calcium, as I mentioned, it's an active system. So when we start lower, you will see a better utilization rate over all the different times. And therefore you see a better eggshell quality when the bird is getting older. We also do know there's a certain threshold, and we still debate about the exact level, but somewhere between 4 and 4.2%, there is a threshold that the bird is not reacting anymore on an increase of calcium, which basically means if we go higher, we don't see a positive effect on eggshell quality anymore. So when we can start lower, we have more room towards going towards this 4.0%. But also, when we have lower calcium levels at start of lay, we have more room for protein and for energy. And I mentioned earlier on, it's very important to have more protein and energy in a layer diet compared to a developer diet. So this is also very much helping. Those are perhaps new thoughts. We do see in practice very, very good results, starting with low calcium levels and slightly increasing over time. Those values are presented in grams, well, in this case, milligrams per hen per day, so not in percentage. It really depends on the feed intake being observed. Obviously, when going down in calcium, we also should go down in phosphorus. So that's what you see over here. Our phosphorus levels also decreased compared to the phosphorus levels in the previous slide. Why? Calcium levels decreased. And because calcium and phosphorus are using the same transporters, you should work both with them. You can not only reduce one of the two, so keep that in mind as well. And then just to inform you a little bit better, we have some extra information included. So there's some more information about sustainability, about deforestation and so on, and about how mainly Europe is calculating with this. There is some more information about alternative raw materials, how to work with them, what to do, and so on. And there is more information about the mycotoxin levels, for example, that we keep in mind, because we do see that the pressure of mycotoxin, of course, is increasing. You can find our new nutrition guide online. Every guide with the white bird is the newest guide. The earlier version had a brown bird. So it's applicable for both white and brown, but it's just for us to recognize whether we have the old version or a new version. If you go to our website, you can download them, or you can also get them via Poultry School if you like. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and please let me know if there's any question.
Thank you, Tela, for your presentation. I think was very clear. And as you say, we will be sharing the guides in our platform, and obviously also they can find it in your platform. So I don't know if you can see, Stella, in your bottom there is a square Q and answers. If you can read it, we have you can go and you can start reading them and answer live. Okay.
Yeah, perfect. So in that case, I will stop sharing the screen and focus on the question.
Yes.
Yeah. So the first question is, how practical is it to convert egg mass into egg number? And can you share some practical tips? Well, in general, egg mass is the combination of the egg numbers in percentage times the egg weight. So that's the way you can convert them, which means you need to measure the egg weight to have this number. And then why is it so important? Because you will see at the end egg weight and egg number have a negative correlation, which means if one is very high, if the egg weight is very high, then most likely you will see a lower egg number and vice versa. So it depends on your goal whether you would like to have a highest egg weight or a highest egg number. That really depends on the finances and economics from each market. And therefore, this egg mass is so important because whether a bird is producing a little bit less eggs but very heavy eggs, or a little bit more eggs but lower egg weights, the requirement is the same because she has the same amount of egg mass. There is a question about starch in new guides, especially corn, soya, wheat brand diets. I really like this question, to be honest. Why? Starch can have a very high impact on liver health, mainly fatty liver. So we don't publish a recommendation in starch, but we take into account that starch in the layer diets, in rearing it can be slightly higher, but starch in the layer diets preferably are below 38%. Why? You will see when you focus on starch, you will also increase a little bit of the oil levels. And oil is so much more easy for a bird to handle compared to starch, because producing lipoproteins from starch in the liver is a far more complex process and provides more pressure on the liver. So we don't mention recommendation in starch, but I would take into account maximum 38%. This will really reduce the risk of fatty livers. There is another question in slide 13 is showing a protein level of 17%, is running 19% too high because we do see 6 grams of eggs at 28, 29 weeks of age, up to 65 grams at 70 to 90 weeks of age. The levels I showed you were based on a 110 grams of feed intake diet. So for protein, it's really important to focus on what is the feed intake and what is your protein level and this combination. Sometimes we do see 19% of protein, but that's really in really dense diets. For example, when you observe high heat stress occasions, heat stress is reducing the feed intake, and therefore you can work a little bit by concentrating the diet to still make sure there is enough. In general, I would say 19% is very high. The negative side of high protein levels, well, first of all, it's costly. It can push your egg weight a little bit too much, although your egg weight level seems to be quite normal. But if you have too high protein levels and it's not all being digested, you can see some gut health issues. If you see so, you're too high with your protein levels. And in general, there is a kind of trend reducing protein, but focusing more on the digestible amino acids. When you see the digestible amino acids are good and you formulate based on this, you can release actually the minimum of protein because you will cover protein levels via your amino acid levels. And it's more accurate and it will help you to prevent this oversupply of protein. The next question, I just follow them on order. So the next question is about the recommendation of decalcium phosphate or monocalcium phosphate in layer feeds. Most likely you will see with the newest enzymes, the newest phytases, that not all layer diets do include indeed a phosphorus source. In general, I'm quite a fan, especially in the layer phase, to still have some decalcium or monocalcium phosphate in your laying hens. And when you see the bird is struggling a bit with the feed intake, or when she's struggling a little bit with overall growth, I'm also a fan of boosting like 1 week or 2 weeks with a monocalcium phosphate source, or decalcium phosphate, but just to stimulate bone health. It's, to my opinion, very crucial. Yeah. So it depends a little bit on your phytase matrix, whether it will allow or not allow, but having a mineral phosphorus source in your layer feed, especially start of lay, is quite helpful, especially as you're planning to take them so long. Is there any plan for transitioning dietary calcium from growing, laying onset, and during the layer phase? Yeah, we focus indeed on total calcium. We don't focus on dietary or available calcium. What's the reason behind it? We try to write our nutrition guide that it's easy to read for all technical people and not only for nutritionists. And it's always very difficult to explain to people that dietary calcium is higher than total calcium. So we know it from a background that in total calcium, we were not taking into account phytases. That's the reason that we focus on total calcium, but it's also one of the reasons that total calcium can be reduced because we do know that more calcium is being opened via the recent enzymes. So is there any plan to transition them? It's not, because it's just too difficult explaining them, but we convert it back in our total calcium level, the science behind it. There is a question about top dressing with limestone, with coarse limestone, when there's actual qualities for layers over 100 weeks old, and how to apply them and how to dose them. In general, yes, I mentioned that about the coarse calcium. It takes longer before it dissolves, so there's more calcium available during the night, and therefore it really works on actual issues. How to apply them? Ideally, they're supplied in the late afternoon, and that can be via spreading it in the barn. It can be via top dressing on the feeder chain. Sometimes we do see separate bins, and then you will also see that the bird will start pecking those coarser limestone particles when they require them. So there are multiple methods, and the dosing really, really depends on what is your current level, but also what has been your calcium levels throughout all the different stages. There's also a question whether there's a major difference between layers and parent stocks in terms of calcium requirements, and in transitional formulation. In general, the major difference is you're not producing a table egg, but you're producing a hatching egg. And the major difference, therefore, is within the vitamin mineral levels. So yeah, you really will need to have a different premix to make sure there is a good quality embryo coming out of it. But there is no big difference in terms of calcium requirements or any other requirements, because the bird is already bred for producing eggs. And that's also for parent stocks as well as for commercial layers. So there's a question, how much calcium does a layer use for shell formation from the bone and the feet? That's what I mentioned very shortly. Around 30% will come from the medullary bone and around 70% will come via the feet. And we do see the more you get via the feet, the better actual qualities you will maintain throughout the life. There's a question if cage layers are more prone to fatty liver. And that's indeed true. Why? When there is less movement of the bird, the metabolism is being changed as well. And that's causing also more fatty liver health issues. So that's something, that's one of the critical factors, but not some which can be overcome easily. There is a question if it's also related to genetics and how to minimize this in highly dense cage layers. Yes, it's linked with genetics. Why? The more productive your laying hen is, the more estrogen levels your bird will have as well. And higher estrogen levels are causing a more likely risk for fatty liver. So it basically means that the breeds which are more prone to observe fatty liver are also often more productive. That's why you see them on backyard farms. It's a little bit less compared to the more intense cage layers indeed. Minimizing it with the cage layers, well, we focus on the lipotrophic factors, so a lot of the Go line, some of the B vitamins and so on. Maximizing starch, as I mentioned already. Yeah, density and movement keeps on one being one of the important factors as well. There is a question on how much of the crude protein we can reduce if all the amino acids are balanced on on standard ileal digestibility values in both production as well as the rearing phases. In those cases, I would say you can easily reduce by 1%. But please take into account also the sum of the non-essential amino acids. So normally when you take into account isoleucine, you will see that you have the right level of all the non-essential amino acids, because isoleucine is a limiting one at a certain moment, but it's not being supplied synthetically. So in general, I do see when you formulate and take into account SID isoleucine, it should be fine. If not, then it would be good to focus on the total balance, total amount of non-essential amino acids, to make sure that also the non-essential amino acids are becoming essential at a certain moment. But yeah, you can really reduce your crude protein a lot if you do so. There is a question whether there is a relation between dietary fiber content of the diet and mortality. Yes, there is. Not per se mortality, perhaps there is as well. I haven't seen this clear link yet, but for sure there is a link between dietary fiber and for example, packing behavior, which can result in cannibalism and mortality. We do see this more on alternative housing systems compared to cage housing system, and that's the reason why in cages we often see much lower dietary fiber content. Dietary fiber is always a quite difficult term, because actually we are looking for coarse insoluble type of fibers when we look to layer hang diets. Those are working the best. And then we talk about rye hulls, we talk about oat hulls, we talk about barley might work, sunflower is working quite good. So insoluble and coarse type of fibers. Wheat bran is often seen as a very good fiber, which is true from a chemical point of view, but it really misses the structure to have a very good and positive effect. So it will still have a positive effect on your gut peristaltics, but it will not have a very positive effect on gizzard formation. That's something, those are two different things. So if you focus on dietary fibers, I would like to focus a lot on the coarse type of insoluble fibers. So there's a question, I think, based on my response between the monocalcium phosphate and the decalcium phosphate during the different stages and what has been the preferred source. Not scientifically proven, I should also mention. I have a preference for the decalcium phosphate. And what is the reason behind it? Especially in rearing, you need to have more calcium than you need to have phosphorus. So the decalcium phosphate, it has a slightly higher calcium value compared to phosphorus. And calcium carbonate, which is basically the limestone otherwise, has the carbonate source. And this carbonate source can increase the gizzard pH. Well, actually, we would like to see a lowest pH as possible. So we would like to reduce the gizzard pH via the normal nutrients as well. When you start using decalcium phosphate, you have a less amount of calcium carbonate being supplied as well, and this will therefore have a positive effect on the gizzard pH. It's not scientifically proven that it should work, so it also often matters a little bit between the price. But yeah, if you have a preference and price-wise it doesn't matter, I would prefer the decalcium phosphate over the monocalcium phosphate for this reason. Questions are keeping up coming. So the question is how to maintain a 50-gram egg mass throughout the entire laying cycle. I think for maintaining the right egg mass throughout the laying cycle, it first of all starts with having the right pullet, because only robust pullets are able to continue all cycle long. 50 grams egg mass is not too high, so you will not stimulate them too much with nutrition for pushing for egg weight. But I would mainly focus then on the egg numbers and how to achieve the maximum egg numbers, because this will really help you. how to maintain it. It's a sum of a lot of things. So focus on the liver health, focus on the robustness of your pullet, and focus a lot also on the body weight of your layer. Because once you start increasing a lot, then often it can be one of the risks for fatty livers as well, because then she's growing mainly in fat deposition, and that's something you don't want to have. But yeah, keep your layers healthy and try to not stimulate too much via the feed. So there's also a question on sharing on night feeding and duration and how many days you can continue with doing so. Yeah, we call the night feeding so-called midnight snack. So I think if you start Googling on it, you can have some more information. A midnight snack, if allowed, within the EU, it's not allowed, but if allowed, we do see positive effects on mainly eggshell formation, because new calcium supply is delivered during the night, but also on total feed intake, especially in the hot climate conditions. It will really work. It's very important that you have the midnight snack in the middle of the day, the middle of the night, I should say, between 1 and 1.5 hours, and that also the birds to have access to the water again. In cage housing, this is quite easy. In alternative housing, this is very challenging, so we don't advise it too much. But yeah, in cage housing, this is something you can work. How many days will you continue? It depends. I would say continue as long as you need to, because as long as you keep it in the middle of the dark period, it will not interfere with the light program as observed by the bird, and therefore not interfering with the production levels as well of the bird. When you're not exactly in the middle of the night, but slightly more towards the morning or more towards the evening, then you can see it as a prolonged or extended day length, and then it will affect performance. So therefore, that's very crucial. And you can continue as long as you need to. The only thing is when you start in rearing, then you need to be a bit more careful, because you should start it before week 12 in rearing if you do so. If you start too late in rearing, they can observe it as a small stimulation already for sexual maturity. There's a question whether more fat will help in reducing the fatty liver in caged layers. Yes, because that's more focusing again. When you increase fat, you will reduce your starch levels. So when I talk about increasing fat for fatty livers, I talk about increasing fat with similar energy values and therefore lower starch levels. Because as I mentioned, starch is so much more difficult to convert compared to fat. And that's the reason why your liver pressure is going down, and your fatty liver risk is going down as well. So it works in all layers, whether it's in cages or not.
Stella, for a matter of time, we'll answer 2 more questions.
Yeah, 2 more questions.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. Because there are a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, we have been almost 15 minutes in question right now. So you can answer 2 more. And then anyone that would like to reach you, you already share your email and
Yeah.
they can reach you. Okay.
Very good.
Thank you.
Very good. There is a question whether higher proteins can lose your manure due to protein bypass. What we will see, if you have too high protein levels, you can observe, as long as all the protein is being used, it doesn't matter. But when not all the protein can be utilized by the bird because the protein levels are too high, then we can see some more wet manure, because there's too much protein left for the bacteria, and you get some more bacterial fermentation, which might be good in some animals, but not so much in poultry, and not in layers either. So when you have too high protein levels and you see those foamy droppings and you see some more wet manure, yeah, then you're too high and it can cause some problems. And that's the reason why we focus more and more on the digestible amino acids, so you can also reduce your protein levels. And there's a very interesting question about, is it practically possible to formulate on a diet having 7% of fiber, as suggested by some nutritionists? Yes, it is possible, that's for sure. Whether it's economically interesting is the second question, because 7% is relatively high. for me, you should not per se go towards the 7% as long as you have this coarse and structural fiber. So sometimes I do see people are achieving the 7%, but then via wheat bran. Yeah, and as I mentioned before, that's for me not the right type of fiber going for it. So it is possible, and depending on the raw materials, of course, being available, but especially in Europe, you will see it's easily possible to achieve the 7%, though it might be costly. And the question is a little bit, which problem are you trying to solve when going towards 7%? In general, for alternative house birds, I tend to see 4.5 is already enough. Yeah, but especially when you have the coarse structural type of fibers. Then I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And if there's any question, feel free to contact us.
Estella, thank you very much for the time. I think that, as always, this is the second webinar that we are doing with you, and I'm very excited about how all the presentation and all the engagement of the people with the question. I think this is one of the main reasons we're doing this, to have this type of dynamics in our presentation. So thank you, everyone that joined us for the live presentation, and to all the people that will be watching this video later. Thank you very much to Hendrix Genetics, and thank you, Stella. And we're
Thank you very much.
looking forward to keep doing this collaboration. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.